He's not breathing. Please, tell me what to do.
At 18, Sarah Reynolds takes her first ever flight, heart pounding with hope and a single suitcase of dreams. Moments later, the plane lurches into chaos. Screams echo, oxygen masks drop, and across the aisle, corporate titan Jonathan Sinclair collapses to the floor. Passengers freeze. Fear grips the cabin. But Sarah moves, driven by something she can't name. She drops beside him, pressing her hands into his chest, whispering, "Stay with me. Please don't leave me." She keeps counting, breath held until his eyes flicker open, and in a frail whisper, barely more than a breath, he says 3 words that rip something loose inside her. Those words haunt her in ways she'll only discover once the flight lands. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Reynolds never had the kind of childhood people write about in fairy tales. She grew up in the worn-down streets of Detroit, where every corner carried a story of struggle, and survival was more of a daily ritual than a choice. Her father, the only man who ever truly protected her, died when she was still a little girl, and her mother disappeared soon after, leaving Sarah in the care of her aging grandmother. That woman became her anchor, raising her on wisdom, sacrifice, and the quiet kind of love that never asks for anything in return. Sarah learned early how to live with less, how to find strength in an empty refrigerator, how to see beauty in a secondhand backpack she carried everywhere. And now, clutched against her chest on this flight, that same backpack holds her entire life as she heads to London, chasing the whispers of a mysterious inheritance. As the plane lifted above the clouds, Sarah Reynolds pressed her forehead to the cold window, trying to quiet the storm of nerves inside her. She had never been this far from home, never seen the world stretch so endlessly beneath her. Around her, economy class was a picture of weary travelers, parents keeping kids calm, students with headphones, workers clutching laptops. But just beyond the thin curtain that divided them from first class, life seemed to belong to another universe entirely. There, luxury whispered from every leather seat and crystal glass. And it was there, in that world she didn't belong to, that Sarah noticed Jonathan Sinclair for the first time. His tailored suit, the kind she'd only ever seen on magazine covers, should have made him appear untouchable. Yet when his eyes briefly locked with hers, something flickered, recognition, almost fear, before he quickly looked away, as though her presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't control. It didn't take long for Sarah Reynolds to see another side of Jonathan Sinclair, a side that matched the kind of stories she had only ever overheard about men of his stature: powerful, wealthy, untouchable. When a flight attendant politely asked him to adjust his seat during meal service, he responded with the kind of cold arrogance that silenced the entire row. His tone was sharp, dismissive, as though kindness was beneath him. Sarah, watching from just a few rows behind, felt a mix of annoyance and curiosity. Yet moments later, she caught something stranger. Jonathan turned his head toward a sharply dressed man across the aisle and addressed him not with formality, but with familiarity, calling him Daniel, in a way that carried both weight and warning. The man stiffened but said nothing. For Sarah, it was a tiny crack in Jonathan's polished exterior, a glimpse of something hidden, something personal he didn't want the world to see. When Jonathan Sinclair finally rose from his seat to head toward the lavatory, his movements carried the weight of a man used to being watched, but not questioned. Yet in that fleeting moment, something slipped, literally. A small photograph slid from the inner pocket of his jacket and fluttered silently to the carpeted aisle. No one else seemed to notice, but Sarah Reynolds did. Her heart quickened as she leaned down, fingers trembling, and slid the photo into her palm before anyone could see. She expected an image of prestige, perhaps a gala, a business partner, a reminder of his glamorous world. But as she carefully unfolded the worn edges, Sarah froze. Staring back at her were 2 familiar faces, her own parents years younger, smiling together in a way she had never witnessed in real life. A chill rippled through her. Why would Jonathan Sinclair, a man of unimaginable wealth, carry a photo of the family she barely knew? Sarah Reynolds shoved the photograph deep into the pages of the book resting on her lap, her chest rising and falling as though she'd been caught in some forbidden act. Her thoughts spiraled, crashing into each other. Why would Jonathan Sinclair, a man who lived in an entirely different world, carry proof that he knew her parents? Was it a coincidence, or had she been led onto this very flight for a reason she couldn't yet understand? The questions pounded against her ribs, and just as her pulse reached a breaking point, the aircraft shuddered violently. Overhead bins rattled, passengers gasped, and the oxygen masks swayed like pendulums. The turbulence tore through the cabin, but inside Sarah, a storm far greater raged. As the plane rocked, she pressed her hand against her chest, gripping the secret hidden in her book. The sky outside was chaos, and so was she, caught between fear, fate, and a truth that threatened to break her world apart. As the turbulence finally eased, Sarah Reynolds sat frozen in her seat, clutching the hidden photograph as though it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing too fast to anchor. It was then that the elderly woman beside her, Ms. Eleanor Brooks, gently placed a hand over Sarah's trembling fingers. Her voice was soft, but carried a weight that cut through the chaos around them. "You look like a young woman carrying a storm inside," she said, her eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom only time can give. Sarah tried to force a smile, to dismiss it, but Eleanor leaned closer. "Family secrets," she whispered, "have a way of finding us, when we're finally strong enough to face them." The words sank deep, unsettling Sarah further. How could this stranger sense the very thing Sarah was trying to hide? The secret photograph now burning against her chest. Back in first class, Jonathan Sinclair shifted in his seat, his hand brushing briefly across his chest as though he was swatting away a discomfort too small to matter. But then, without warning, his body stiffened, his face drained of color, and he lurched forward, collapsing against the aisle with a heavy thud. Gasps rippled through the cabin, silverware clattered to the floor, and voices rose in frightened confusion. The flight attendants rushed forward, their calm masks slipping as they called out desperately, "Is there a doctor on board? Please, we need medical assistance." Yet the silence that followed was deafening. Dozens of passengers looked around, eyes darting, but no one moved. Fear pinned them to their seats. Sarah Reynolds, her heart still pounding from her own secret discovery, could only watch as this powerful man, this untouchable figure of wealth and arrogance, lay helpless on the floor, his life dangling by a thread that no one seemed willing to grasp. For a few agonizing seconds, Sarah Reynolds sat frozen in her seat, every instinct screaming at her to stay back, to let someone else, someone older, someone qualified, step forward. But no one did. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the frantic cries of the flight attendants and the shallow wheeze of Jonathan Sinclair's fading breath. And then, like a spark in the dark, a memory surfaced. Her grandmother's nurse, patiently guiding her small hands years ago, teaching her the rhythm of chest compressions after her grandmother's fainting spells. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears, but her body moved before doubt could drag her back. She dropped to her knees beside Jonathan, pressing the heel of her palms into his chest, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3. Stay with me. Each push was fueled by fear, courage, and something deeper she couldn't yet name, as the cabin watched a poor girl fight to save a billionaire's life. Jonathan Sinclair's chest rose shallowly under Sarah Reynolds' desperate compressions, and for a terrifying moment she thought she was losing him. Then, with a strained gasp, his eyelids fluttered open, and his trembling hand reached weakly for hers. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat, as his cold fingers curled around hers with surprising strength. His lips moved, struggling to form words, and she leaned closer, desperate to hear. In a voice so faint it was almost lost in the hum of the engines, he whispered, "Sarah, your father was my brother." Time seemed to collapse. The cabin noise, the passengers, the flight attendants, all of it faded into silence. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, her mind spinning violently. Her father? His brother? How could a man like Jonathan Sinclair, this untouchable giant of wealth, be tied by blood to the father she had lost in poverty? The words shattered her, leaving her trembling on the edge of a truth she wasn't ready to face. Sarah Reynolds' entire body trembled as Jonathan Sinclair's words echoed in her mind. Your father was my brother. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Her father had lived and died in poverty, a man who worked himself to the bone to provide for her until the day his heart gave out. And yet here was Jonathan Sinclair, a titan of unimaginable wealth, tied to him by blood? The thought nearly broke her concentration, but Jonathan's body jerked beneath her hands, forcing her back into the present. She pressed down harder, whispering the counts like a prayer. And then, as her eyes caught the outline of the hidden photograph peeking from her book, a chilling clarity hit her. That photo of her parents smiling before she was even born. Jonathan wasn't a stranger who had stumbled into her life. He had known them. He had known her. And now, half conscious and slipping away, he was finally revealing why. The cabin filled with a tense hum as the captain's voice cracked through the intercom, calm but urgent. Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing in Shannon, Ireland. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. The words sent a shiver through the passengers, but their eyes weren't on the windows or the crew. They were fixed on Sarah Reynolds. This 18-year-old girl, who minutes ago was invisible in the economy cabin, now knelt in the aisle of first class, her hands steady on the chest of Jonathan Sinclair, a man the world admired, envied, and feared. With every push, every whispered count under her breath, she fought for his life as if it were her own. And when the attendants finally took over, slipping an oxygen mask over his face and stabilizing his pulse, the entire plane seemed to exhale at once. Passengers who hadn't even noticed Sarah before now looked at her with awe, as though they'd just witnessed something impossible. As the plane's wheels screeched against the runway and finally rolled to a halt, relief rippled through the cabin like a wave. Paramedics were already waiting on the tarmac, rushing aboard with stretchers and equipment. Sarah Reynolds sat slumped in her seat, her hands still trembling, her heartbeat still pounding from the battle she had just fought. But before she could even process what had happened, Jonathan Sinclair was being lifted onto a stretcher, his body frail, his face pale against the flashing lights of the ambulance outside. And then, in a sudden burst of strength, his hand reached out, grasping Sarah's wrist with a desperate urgency. She leaned closer, and his lips brushed her ear with words that made her blood run cold. London will explain everything. Don't let them trick you. And just like that, he was pulled away, disappearing into the ambulance, leaving Sarah shaken, breathless, and drowning in questions. Hours later, after endless questions from officials and the chaos of watching Jonathan Sinclair disappear behind the ambulance doors, Sarah Reynolds found herself back in the terminal, clutching the worn backpack that held everything she owned. But something inside her had shifted forever. She was no longer the invisible girl from Detroit who boarded a plane with nothing but hope and a mysterious inheritance waiting overseas. She was now tied, in ways she didn't yet understand, to one of the most powerful men alive, and to secrets that seemed to reach across oceans and generations. As she walked toward her connecting gate, the photograph pressed against her chest like a heartbeat, reminding her this wasn't chance. It was fate. When she finally stepped onto the next flight bound for London, Sarah knew she wasn't just chasing opportunity anymore. She was carrying the weight of a legacy, one that would either break her or define her. In the end, what happened aboard that flight was more than just an emergency in the skies. It was the moment Sarah Reynolds' life cracked open, revealing truths that had been buried for decades. With courage born not of training but of heart, she saved Jonathan Sinclair, a man who, in his final moments of strength, revealed that their lives were bound together by blood and secrets. And as she stepped onto that flight to London, Sarah carried with her not just a backpack of belongings but the heavy weight of destiny itself. Sometimes the most ordinary among us are chosen to face extraordinary truths. And so we ask you, what would you do if one day you discovered a millionaire carried a photograph of your parents? Before you answer, don't forget to let us know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the stories still to come.